Margaret Williams stepped out of her old Honda Civic and looked up at the weathered sign that read, Pine Valley Shooting Range. The autumn wind caught her gray hair, and she pushed it back with a wrinkled hand. At 72 years old, she moved slowly, but with purpose, her floral dress and cardigan making her look like someone heading to a church social rather than a gun range. The parking lot was filled mostly with pickup trucks and motorcycles. Young men in camouflage and tactical gear were unloading rifle cases and ammunition boxes. Their conversations were loud and filled with military jargon and boasts about their latest equipment purchases. Margaret clutched her small purse closer and walked toward the main building. As she approached the entrance, a group of men in their 30s noticed her. They wore matching T-shirts from some shooting club and had expensive-looking firearms cases slung over their shoulders. "Hey, look at that," one of them whispered, but not quietly enough. "Grandma's lost. Someone should tell her the bingo hall is across town." The others chuckled. "Maybe she's here to ask us to keep the noise down," another added, adjusting his tactical vest. Margaret heard every word, but kept walking. She had dealt with this kind of attitude her entire life. Being a woman in a man's world was nothing new to her. Being an elderly woman in what these young men considered their territory was apparently even more amusing to them. Inside the range building, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of gun oil and cleaning solvent. Display cases lined the walls, showing off the latest in firearms technology. Behind the counter stood Jake Morrison, the range master, a man in his 50s with arms covered in military tattoos. He was helping a customer when Margaret approached. "Excuse me," Margaret said politely, waiting for him to finish with the other customer. Jake looked up and seemed surprised to see her. "Can I help you, ma'am? Are you looking for someone?" "I'd like to use the range, please," Margaret replied simply. The customer Jake had been helping turned around. It was one of the men from the parking lot. "You're kidding, right?" he said with a grin. "Lady, this isn't a place for beginners. These guns have a real kick to them." Jake looked uncomfortable. He had been running this range for 15 years and had seen all types, but elderly women wanting to shoot were definitely rare. "Ma'am, have you ever fired a weapon before? We offer basic safety courses on weekends." "I'd just like to rent a rifle and use the range," Margaret repeated patiently. The men nearby started to gather, sensing entertainment. Word spread quickly in the small building, and soon a small crowd had formed. Someone called out, "Hey everyone, Grandma wants to play soldier." "This I gotta see," another voice added. "Someone get their phone out." Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had faced worse than this. Much worse. Jake felt pressured by the crowd. "Look, Mrs. Williams, Margaret Williams. Mrs. Williams, I need to see some identification and have you sign these waivers, and I really think you should consider starting with something smaller. Maybe a .22 rifle?" Margaret nodded and pulled out her driver's license and credit card. As Jake processed her information, the crowd of men continued their commentary. $20 says she can't even hold it steady," one bet. "I'll take that bet," another replied. "20 says she runs crying after the first shot." "You're both wrong," a third added. "I don't think she'll even pull the trigger." Margaret signed the paperwork without looking up at them. Jake handed her safety glasses and ear protection. "Lane 7 is open," he said, pointing toward the range. "I'll bring you a rifle in a moment." As Margaret walked toward the shooting lanes, the crowd followed at a distance. The range had 10 lanes separated by concrete dividers. Each lane was 25 yards long, with paper targets hanging from automated systems. Margaret set down her purse and put on her safety equipment. Jake appeared with a basic hunting rifle. "This is a .308 Winchester," he explained. "It's a good general-purpose rifle, but it does have significant recoil. Are you sure you don't want to start with something smaller?" "This will be fine," Margaret replied, taking the rifle and examining it briefly. "Have you handled a bolt action before?" Jake asked, genuinely concerned now. Yes, I have. The way she said it made Jake pause. There was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that didn't match the nervous grandmother image the crowd expected. But the men behind them were getting louder and more obnoxious. Come on, Jake, one called out. Let's get this show started. Yeah, we want to see if Granny can hit the broadside of a barn. Jake shrugged and set up a standard target at 25 yards. Take your time, Mrs. Williams. Remember, squeeze the trigger slowly and keep both eyes open. Margaret nodded and stepped up to the firing line. She positioned herself in a standard shooting stance, feet shoulder-width apart, left foot slightly forward. The men behind her continued their running commentary. Look at that stance, one laughed. She's holding it like a broomstick. Somebody should tell her which end the bullets come out of. Margaret ignored them and raised the rifle. She pressed the stock firmly against her shoulder and looked through the scope. Her breathing slowed and steadied. The noise behind her seemed to fade away. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Margaret's mind drifted back 60 years. She was 12 years old again, standing in a cornfield with her father. He was teaching her to shoot rabbits that were eating their crops during the Depression. Food was scarce, and every shot had to count. Remember, Maggie, her father's voice echoed in her memory. Breathe in, breathe halfway out, hold it, and squeeze gently. The shot should surprise you. She remembered her first deer at 14, the pride in her father's eyes when she dropped it with one clean shot at 100 yards. She remembered hunting trips with her brothers, who never once suggested she stay home because she was a girl. Then came the memories of the war. She was 18 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. While the boys shipped out to fight overseas, someone had to put food on the table. Someone had to keep the predators away from the livestock. Someone had to protect the home front. She remembered the day she enlisted in the Women's Army Corps in 1943, the long train ride to training camp, the male instructors who didn't expect much from the female recruits, the shock on their faces when she outshot half the men in her unit. Hey, lady, a voice called from behind her, snapping her back to the present. You gonna shoot that thing or just stand there all day? Margaret blinked and refocused on the target ahead of her. The paper silhouette looked tiny at 25 yards, but she had made much more difficult shots under much more difficult circumstances. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held it. Her finger found the trigger and began applying pressure slowly and steadily. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed through the range. The men behind her erupted in laughter before the smoke had even cleared. Did you see that? She jerked that trigger so hard I'm surprised she didn't fall over. Bet she missed the entire target. Probably put a hole in the ceiling. Margaret lowered the rifle and looked through the scope toward her target. Jake activated the target retrieval system to bring the paper forward so they could all see the result. As the target came closer, the laughter gradually died down. There was a clean hole punched through the paper, just slightly off-center from the bullseye. Lucky shot, someone muttered. Jake looked at the target with surprise. For a first shot with an unfamiliar rifle, it was excellent marksmanship. That's really good, Mrs. Williams. Thank you, Margaret replied quietly. May I have another target? Jake sent a fresh target back out to 25 yards. The crowd of men gathered closer, their amusement turning to curiosity. Maybe the old lady had some experience after all. Margaret loaded another round and raised the rifle again. This time she seemed even more relaxed and confident. The second shot came quicker than the first. When the target was retrieved, there was another hole, this one dead center in the bullseye. The crowd was quieter now, but someone called out, 2 lucky shots. Let's see her do it again. Yeah, 3rd time's the charm. Bet she chokes now. Margaret requested a 3rd target. By now, word was spreading throughout the range building. More people were gathering to watch the elderly woman shoot. Some had come from other lanes, abandoning their own practice sessions. The third shot was perfect center again. So was the fourth, and the fifth. By the sixth shot, the crowd had gone completely silent. Jake was staring at the targets with disbelief. 6 shots, 6 perfect bullseyes. The grouping was so tight you could cover all 6 holes with a quarter. "This is impossible," someone whispered. "Nobody's that good," another added. "She's got to be cheating somehow." Margaret lowered the rifle and looked at Jake. "Could I try something a bit more challenging?" Jake was speechless for a moment. "More challenging? Mrs. Williams, you just shot a perfect group. What did you have in mind? Could you move the target back to 100 yards? The crowd exchanged glances. 100 yards was serious distance for precision shooting. That was where the experienced marksmen practiced, the military veterans and competition shooters. "Ma'am," Jake said slowly, 100 yards is a very long shot with iron sights. Most people use high-powered scopes for that distance." "I understand," Margaret replied, "but I'd like to try it." One of the men in the crowd spoke up. "No way. Nobody shoots that well at 100 yards without proper equipment, especially not—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. "Especially not what?" Margaret asked quietly, looking him directly in the eyes. The man looked uncomfortable. "I just meant, well, you know, at your age, with your eyesight." "My eyesight is fine," Margaret said. "Would anyone like to make a wager?" The crowd stirred with interest. Money made everything more interesting. "What kind of wager?" the man asked. "If I can put 5 shots in the bullseye at 100 yards, you all stop calling me Grandma and treat me with the same respect you'd give any other shooter on this range." The men looked at each other and grinned. This was easy money. "And if you miss," one asked, "then I'll pay for everyone's range time today and apologize for wasting your time." Jake was setting up the 100-yard target before Margaret had even finished speaking. He was as curious as anyone to see what would happen. In 15 years of running this range, he had never seen anything like this. As Margaret prepared for her long-distance shots, she noticed more people gathering. Word was spreading fast. Even some of the staff had stopped what they were doing to watch. She loaded the rifle and took her position. 100 yards seemed like a long way now. The target looked much smaller through the scope, but distance had never intimidated her. In Korea, she had made shots at twice this distance under enemy fire. Korea. That was a lifetime ago. She had been 19 then, part of a special unit that officially didn't exist, the kind of unit that didn't appear in history books, the kind of service that came with classification levels that lasted decades. She pushed those memories away and focused on the target ahead. Her first shot at 100 yards took longer to aim than the previous shots. When she fired, the recoil seemed stronger, but her stance absorbed it easily. The target retrieval system seemed to take forever to bring the paper forward. When it arrived, there was a collective gasp from the crowd. The shot was perfect center, punching a clean hole through the bullseye. "No way," someone whispered. "That's impossible." "She got lucky." Margaret loaded her second round. This shot felt easier than the first. Muscle memory was taking over, bringing back decades of training and experience. The second shot was as perfect as the first. By the fifth shot, the crowd was completely silent. 5 perfect bullseyes at 100 yards. The grouping was so tight, it looked like one slightly elongated hole. Jake stared at the target in disbelief. "Mrs. Williams," he said slowly, "I've been running this range for 15 years. I've seen military snipers, Olympic competitors, and professional shooters. I've never seen marksmanship like this." Margaret smiled slightly and began cleaning the rifle. "Thank you. I enjoyed that." The men who had been making fun of her earlier were standing in stunned silence. A few were already reaching for their wallets to pay for their range time, honoring the bet they had so confidently made. But one man, the leader of the group that had mocked her in the parking lot, wasn't ready to give up. "This is crazy," he said loudly. "Nobody shoots like that. Not at her age. Not without years of recent practice. I think she's got some kind of special equipment or something. Jake started to object, but Margaret held up her hand. It's all right, she said. I understand his skepticism. She looked directly at the doubter. Young man, what's your name? Rick, he replied, still angry about being shown up. Rick, have you ever been in the military? Army Reserve for 6 years, he said proudly. What was your specialty? Infantry. I know my way around weapons. Margaret nodded. I'm sure you do. What's the best group you've ever shot at 100 yards? Rick hesitated. He didn't want to admit that his best day at 100 yards was barely keeping all his shots on the target, let alone in the bullseye. I can usually keep them all in the black, he said, referring to the outer rings of the target. That's very good, Margaret said sincerely. You should be proud of that. It takes skill and practice. Her genuine praise made Rick feel worse about his earlier behavior, but he still wasn't ready to back down completely. Look, lady, I don't know who you are or where you learned to shoot, but this whole thing is suspicious. Maybe you had someone else sight in that rifle earlier. Maybe you practiced here before. Maybe you're not who you say you are. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Jake. Mr. Morrison, has that rifle been sighted in recently? No, ma'am, Jake replied. That's one of our rental rifles. It gets used by different people every day. Nobody's had time to sight it in perfectly. So the shots I just made were with an unfamiliar rifle that hasn't been properly zeroed? Jake nodded. That's right, which makes what you just did even more impressive. Margaret turned back to Rick. And this is my first time at this range. I've never been here before today. Rick was getting frustrated. Then how? How does a 70-year-old woman in a flower dress outshoot everyone on this range? Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. How much should she tell them? How much was she allowed to tell them, even after all these years? I've had some training, she said simply. What kind of training? Rick pressed. Jake was listening intently now, too. He was getting the feeling there was much more to Margaret Williams than met the eye. Military training, Margaret replied. Women weren't in combat roles back then, Rick said dismissively. They were nurses and clerks. Margaret's eyes flashed with something that made Rick take a step back. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of someone much harder and more dangerous than the pleasant grandmother standing before him. You're absolutely right, Margaret said calmly. Officially, women weren't in combat roles. Officially, there were a lot of things that never happened. The way she said it sent a chill through the crowd. There was something in her voice, a weight of experience and knowledge that suggested she had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. Jake was studying her face now, trying to read between the lines. In his 15 years running the range, he had met a lot of veterans. There was something about their eyes, a look that came from seeing combat. Margaret Williams had that look. Mrs. Williams, he said carefully, exactly what kind of military service did you have? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, as if there were things she still couldn't say even after all these decades. Let's just say that when the country needed certain jobs done quietly, they found people who could do them, and they didn't always worry about whether those people were men or women. The crowd was hanging on every word now. Even Rick had stopped his objections and was listening intently. Are you saying you were in special operations? Jake asked. I'm saying that there are many stories from that era that will never be told, Margaret replied diplomatically. Many people who served in ways that don't appear in the official records. She checked her watch and began gathering her things. I should be going now. Thank you for the use of your range, Mr. Morrison. It was nostalgic. As she headed toward the door, the crowd parted to let her pass. The men who had been mocking her earlier looked embarrassed and ashamed. A few mumbled apologies as she walked by. Jake followed her to the counter. Mrs. Williams, wait. That was incredible shooting. Really incredible. I'd love to know more about your background. Margaret smiled at him. Some stories are better left untold, dear. But thank you for being so kind. As she reached for the door, Jake called out, Mrs. Williams, will you be coming back? She paused and looked back at him. Perhaps, but next time, I might bring my own rifle. The way she said it suggested that her own rifle was something special indeed. And as Margaret Williams walked out into the afternoon sun, every person in that range knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had met someone whose story was far more interesting and dangerous than they could ever imagine. Rick stood staring at the door long after she had gone. The 5 perfect targets were still hanging on the wall, proof that what had just happened wasn't a dream. For the first time in his life, he understood that he had vastly underestimated someone based on their appearance, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that Margaret Williams was the kind of person you didn't want to underestimate. Not ever. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Williams first walked into Pine Valley shooting range. In those 3 weeks, word had spread throughout the local shooting community about the elderly woman who could outshoot anyone who challenged her. The story had grown with each telling, becoming the kind of legend that shooters loved to debate over coffee and ammunition catalogs. Jake Morrison found himself thinking about Margaret Williams almost daily. He had tried researching her name online, but found nothing unusual. Just an ordinary widow who had worked as a school librarian for 30 years before retiring. Nothing in the public record suggested any military service or special training, yet Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to her story. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Jake was updating inventory when the bell above the front door chimed. He looked up to see Margaret walking in, shaking water droplets from the same cardigan she had worn on her first visit. Mrs. Williams, Jake said, genuinely pleased to see her. Welcome back. How are you today? Hello, Mr. Morrison. I'm well, thank you. She approached the counter with the same quiet dignity she had displayed during her previous visit. I was hoping to use the range again today. Of course. Same rifle as last time? Margaret shook her head. Actually, I brought my own today. She gestured toward her car outside. If that's permitted. Jake was immediately curious. Absolutely. Would you like me to help you bring it in? That's very kind of you. Jake followed Margaret outside to her Honda Civic. She opened the trunk to reveal a hard case that looked military grade. It was worn but well-maintained, with several faded stickers that Jake couldn't quite read in the dim afternoon light. As they carried the case inside, Jake noticed how heavy it was. Whatever rifle Margaret owned, it wasn't a simple hunting rifle. Back inside, Margaret set the case on the counter and opened it with practiced efficiency. Jake's eyes widened. Inside was a rifle unlike anything he had seen outside of military circles. It was a precision instrument, clearly custom-built, with modifications that suggested serious long-range work. The scope alone probably cost more than most people's entire shooting setup. Mrs. Williams, Jake said slowly, this is a very impressive rifle. Thank you. I've had it for a long time. Jake examined the weapon more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. This wasn't something you could buy in a store. This was the kind of rifle that was built by specialists for very specific purposes. May I ask where you acquired this? Margaret was assembling the rifle with movements that spoke of decades of familiarity. It was a gift, she said simply. Some gift, Jake murmured. This looks like serious long-range equipment. It's accurate at considerable distances, Margaret confirmed. As word spread that Margaret Williams had returned, people began gathering again. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The mockery and disbelief of 3 weeks ago had been replaced by curiosity and respect. Even Rick, the man who had challenged her most aggressively, approached with a more humble demeanor. Mrs. Williams, Rick said, I owe you an apology for how I acted last time. That was incredible shooting." Margaret smiled graciously. "Apology accepted, Rick. We all make assumptions sometimes." "I was wondering," Rick continued nervously, "if you'd be willing to give some tips. I mean, if you have time." Before Margaret could respond, Jake interrupted. "Mrs. Williams, would you mind if I asked you to try our long-range course today?" Margaret looked interested. "How long?" "We have targets out to 500 yards. Most people don't even attempt those distances." A murmur went through the small crowd that had gathered. 500 yards was serious distance. That was where only the most experienced marksmen practiced. "I think I'd enjoy that," Margaret said. Jake led the group to the far end of the range, where the long-distance lanes were located. These lanes were used infrequently and primarily by military and law enforcement personnel for specialized training. The targets at 500 yards looked impossibly small. As Margaret set up her rifle, Jake noticed several things that reinforced his growing suspicions about her background. The way she checked wind conditions, the mathematical precision with which she adjusted her scope, the professional manner in which she prepared her shooting position. "Mrs. Williams," Jake said, "have you shot at this distance before?" "Once or twice," she replied, settling into position. The crowd gathered behind the firing line was larger now. Word had somehow spread beyond the range, and several serious shooters from other facilities had arrived to witness what everyone was calling the grandmother who could outshoot anyone. Margaret's first shot at 500 yards took nearly a minute to prepare. She checked and rechecked her scope settings, tested the wind with a small flag, and made minute adjustments to her position. When she finally fired, the rifle's report was sharp and authoritative. The target retrieval system at 500 yards was electronic, with a camera that displayed the results on a monitor. When the image appeared, showing a perfect bullseye hit, the crowd erupted in amazed whispers. "Incredible," someone said. "I've never seen anything like it." "That's Olympic-level shooting." Margaret's second shot was equally perfect. So was her third. By the time she had fired 5 rounds, creating a group that could be covered by a nickel, the crowd had grown silent with awe. Jake was staring at the monitor in disbelief. "Mrs. Williams, I have to ask, what exactly was your military specialty?" Margaret was cleaning her rifle with the same methodical precision she had shown in everything else. "I did various jobs," she said vaguely. "Various jobs?" Rick repeated. "Ma'am, with all due respect, nobody shoots like that from various jobs. That's world-class marksmanship." Margaret looked up from her rifle. For a moment, Jake saw something in her eyes that made him think of the veterans he knew who had seen real combat. Not the weekend warriors or the peacetime soldiers, but the ones who had been in situations where missing the shot meant people died. "Rick," Margaret said gently, "there are some things that happened a long time ago that are better left in the past." But Rick wasn't ready to let it go. His curiosity had overcome his earlier embarrassment. "Please, Mrs. Williams, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. It's just, what you just did is impossible. Nobody shoots groups like that at 500 yards without years of professional training." "And what makes you think I haven't had years of professional training?" Margaret asked. The question hung in the air. Jake realized that Margaret Williams had just admitted in her own careful way that she had indeed received extensive professional training. But when? And where? And for what purpose? "The Korean War," Jake said suddenly, the pieces clicking together in his mind. "You served in Korea." Margaret's hands paused for just a moment in their rifle cleaning routine. "Many people served in Korea," she said carefully. "But not many women," Jake continued. "And definitely not many women in combat roles. Officially." Margaret resumed cleaning her rifle. "As I said before, there were many things that happened in those days that weren't official." An older man in the crowd spoke up, His name was Frank Dobson, and Jake knew him as a Vietnam veteran who came to the range regularly. "Ma'am, I served 2 tours in Nam. I know the look of someone who's been downrange. You've got that look." Margaret glanced at Frank with recognition, one veteran seeing another. "Thank you for your service, Frank." "Thank you for yours," Frank replied solemnly. "Whatever it was." Jake's mind was racing now. "Mrs. Williams, would you mind if I made a phone call? There's someone I'd like to have meet you." "What kind of someone?" Margaret asked cautiously. "A friend of mine, retired military. He might be able to, appreciate your skills better than we can." Margaret considered this for a moment. "I suppose that would be all right?" Jake stepped away and made a quick call on his cell phone. Margaret could hear him speaking in low, urgent tones, but couldn't make out the words. When he returned, he looked excited. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, Jake announced. "Who will?" Rick asked. "Colonel David Hayes, retired. He runs training programs for special operations units. If anyone can appreciate what Mrs. Williams just demonstrated, it's him." The crowd settled in to wait, but Margaret seemed to grow more reserved. She finished cleaning her rifle and carefully packed it away. Jake noticed that she seemed to be preparing to leave. "Mrs. Williams, you don't have to go. Colonel Hayes is a good man, very discreet." "I'm sure he is," Margaret replied. "But some conversations are better avoided." Before Jake could respond, the door opened and a man in his 60s walked in. Despite being in civilian clothes, everything about him screamed military officer. His bearing, his precise movements, his way of scanning the room to assess threats and exits. This was clearly Colonel Hayes. "Jake," the colonel said, approaching with a firm handshake, "you said something about extraordinary marksmanship?" "Colonel Hayes, I'd like you to meet Margaret Williams." The colonel turned to Margaret, and his expression changed subtly. There was a moment of recognition that passed between them, as if they were seeing something in each other that the civilian crowd couldn't understand. "Mrs. Williams," the colonel said formally, "Jake tells me you're quite the marksman." "I do my best," Margaret replied modestly. Colonel Hayes walked over to the monitor that still displayed the image of Margaret's 500-yard target. The tight group of holes in the center of the bullseye looked almost machine-made in their precision. "This is your work?" he asked. "Yes." The colonel studied the target for a long moment, then turned back to Margaret. "What rifle?" Margaret gestured toward her case. "A custom .308. May I see it?" Margaret hesitated, then opened the case again. Colonel Hayes examined the rifle with the eye of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. His whistled appreciation was low and respectful. "This is serious equipment," he said. "Military specification. Custom trigger group. Competition grade barrel. This isn't a hunting rifle." "No," Margaret agreed. "It isn't." The colonel looked at her more intently. "Mrs. Williams, forgive me for asking, but what unit did you serve with?" Margaret's expression became unreadable. "I'm afraid that information is still classified." The colonel's eyebrows rose. "Still classified? After all these years?" "Some classifications last longer than others," Margaret said diplomatically. Colonel Hayes was clearly intrigued now. In his 40 years of military service, he had learned to read between the lines. Margaret Williams was telling him, without saying it directly, that she had been involved in operations so sensitive that they remained classified decades after the fact. "Ma'am," the colonel said with newfound respect, "would you be willing to demonstrate your skills at a more challenging distance?" "What did you have in mind?" "We have access to a 1,000-yard range about 20 minutes from here. It's used for training military and law enforcement snipers." The crowd stirred with excitement. 1,000 yards was an extreme distance, the kind of shooting that separated the experts from the legends. Margaret considered the offer. "I haven't shot at 1,000 yards in quite some time." That's all right, Colonel Hayes said. I'm just curious to see what you can do. Margaret looked around the crowd of eager faces. These people had already seen her do things they thought were impossible. If she agreed to this demonstration, there would be no more pretending to be just an ordinary grandmother. Very well, she said finally, but I'd prefer to keep the group small. Colonel Hayes nodded. Of course, Jake, Rick, Frank, and myself, if that's acceptable. Margaret agreed, and the small group loaded into 2 vehicles for the drive to the military training facility. During the ride, Margaret was quiet, lost in thought. She was about to cross a line she had maintained for decades. Once she demonstrated her skills at 1,000 yards, there would be questions she might not be able to avoid answering. The military facility was impressive, with ranges extending far beyond what civilian facilities could offer. Colonel Hayes led them to a position where the targets appeared as tiny specks in the distance. At 1,000 yards, the target looked impossibly small, even through high-powered binoculars. Margaret set up her rifle with the same methodical precision she had shown before, but now her preparations were even more elaborate. She checked atmospheric conditions, calculated wind drift, and made numerous adjustments to her scope. The process took nearly 10 minutes. Mrs. Williams, Colonel Hayes said quietly, 1,000-yard shots are extremely difficult even for trained snipers. Please don't feel pressure to perform miracles. Margaret smiled slightly. Colonel, the first time I made a shot at this distance, I was 19 years old and lying in a rice paddy in Korea while Chinese soldiers were trying to kill me. This is actually much more comfortable. The casual way she mentioned being under enemy fire while making precision shots sent a chill through the group. This wasn't just exceptional marksmanship they were witnessing. This was a glimpse into a past filled with danger and secrets. Margaret's first shot at 1,000 yards seemed to hang in the air forever before reaching the target. The electronic scoring system showed a hit in the outer ring of the bullseye. Excellent shooting by any measure, but not perfect. Very good, Colonel Hayes said. That's better than most of my trainees on their best day. Margaret was adjusting her scope slightly. I need to account for the different atmospheric conditions here. Give me another shot. Her second shot was perfect center. So was her third. By her 5th shot, she had created a group that would have impressed professional snipers. Colonel Hayes was staring at the target display in amazement. Mrs. Williams, I've been training military marksmen for 20 years. What you just did is extraordinary. Not just the accuracy, but the consistency. That's the kind of shooting that takes years of professional training under extreme conditions. Margaret was packing up her rifle again. Thank you, Colonel. Ma'am, I have to ask, what kind of operations were you involved in that required this level of skill? Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The kind that officially never happened, conducted by people who officially were never there. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly. He understood the world of black operations and classified missions. I see. And you can't discuss the details? Even if I could, I probably shouldn't. Jake had been listening to this exchange with growing fascination. Mrs. Williams, is there anything you can tell us about your service? Margaret considered the question carefully. I can tell you that there were times when our country needed certain problems solved quietly and permanently, and there were people willing to solve those problems regardless of the personal cost. The weight of her words settled over the group. They were beginning to understand that Margaret Williams wasn't just an exceptional marksman. She was someone who had served her country in ways that couldn't be acknowledged or celebrated publicly. As they prepared to leave the facility, Colonel Hayes pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that your service is appreciated, even if it can't be officially recognized. Thank you, Colonel. That means more than you know. If you ever want to talk, off the record, I'd be honored to listen. Margaret smiled sadly. Some stories are meant to stay buried, Colonel, but I appreciate the offer. As they drove back to Pine Valley Shooting Range, Margaret stared out the window at the passing countryside. For decades, she had lived as Margaret Williams, retired librarian and widow. But today, for just a few hours, she had allowed herself to be who she really was. Someone who had served her country in ways that history books would never record. Someone who had made shots that saved lives and changed outcomes. Someone who had sacrificed a normal life for something greater than herself. Back at the range, word of the 1,000-yard demonstration was already spreading. By the time they arrived, a crowd had gathered, eager to hear about what had happened. But Margaret Williams had said all she was going to say. She thanked Jake for the use of his range, nodded respectfully to Colonel Hayes, and headed toward the door. As she reached for the handle, Jake called out one last question. "Mrs. Williams, will you be back?" She turned and smiled. "Perhaps, Mr. Morrison, but next time you might want to have a longer range available." As Margaret Williams disappeared into the evening shadows, everyone in Pine Valley Shooting Range knew they had witnessed something special. They had met a genuine American hero, someone whose service had been so important and so secret that it could never be properly acknowledged. But they also knew there was still more to the story. Margaret Williams had shared glimpses of her past, but the full truth remained hidden behind decades of classification and silence. And somewhere in the back of Jake's mind, a thought was beginning to form. If Margaret Williams had this kind of training and these kinds of skills, there might be evidence of her service somewhere in the range building, evidence that had been hiding in plain sight all along. 6 months had passed since Margaret Williams first walked into Pine Valley Shooting Range. In that time, she had become something of a legend among the shooting community. Stories of her impossible accuracy had spread far beyond the local area, drawing curious marksmen from neighboring states who hoped to witness her skills firsthand. Jake Morrison had tried many times to learn more about Margaret's background, but she remained politely evasive about her past. The only new information he had gained was that she had indeed served in Korea, and that her service had involved classified operations that she still couldn't discuss. It was frustrating for Jake, who felt certain there was an incredible story waiting to be told. On a crisp autumn morning, Jake was in his office doing paperwork when he heard the familiar chime of the front door. Looking through his office window, he saw Margaret Williams entering the range for what had become her weekly visit. But today, something was different. She was accompanied by a man in his 70s, walking slowly with the aid of a cane. Jake came out of his office to greet them. "Mrs. Williams, good morning. How are you today?" "Hello, Mr. Morrison. I'm well, thank you." She gestured to her companion. "I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine. This is Charles Patterson." Jake shook hands with the elderly man, noting the firm grip despite his age and apparent frailty. There was something about Charles Patterson that reminded Jake of Colonel Hayes, that indefinable military bearing that never fully disappeared. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Patterson." "Likewise," Charles replied. His voice was gravelly but strong. "Maggie's told me quite a lot about this place." Jake was immediately struck by the name. In all the months he had known Margaret Williams, no one had ever called her anything but Mrs. Williams or ma'am. The casual use of Maggie suggested a relationship that went back many years. "Mr. Patterson is visiting from Virginia," Margaret explained. "He wanted to see the range where I've been practicing." "Of course," Jake said. "Would you like the usual setup, Mrs. Williams?" "Actually," Charles interrupted, "I was hoping to see Maggie shoot at the longest distance you have available. She's been modest about her abilities, and I'd like to see for myself what all the fuss is about." Jake was puzzled. If Charles was an old friend, surely he would already know about Margaret's exceptional skills. But he led them to the long-range section anyway. As Margaret prepared her rifle, Charles watched with intense interest. Jake noticed that the old man's eyes tracked every movement she made, as if he were evaluating her technique with professional expertise. How long have you two known each other? Jake asked Charles. Oh, Maggie and I go way back, Charles replied vaguely. We worked together briefly in the early 50s. The way he said worked together made Jake's detective instincts tingle. These two hadn't just been friends or colleagues. They had been involved in something significant together. Margaret's shooting that day was as spectacular as always. 5 perfect shots at 500 yards, creating a group that could be covered with a quarter. Charles watched in silence, nodding occasionally as if confirming something he already knew. Impressive, Charles said when Margaret finished. Very impressive indeed. But Jake caught something in his tone. Charles wasn't surprised by Margaret's performance. He had expected exactly what he had witnessed. This whole demonstration had been some kind of test or verification. As they prepared to leave, Charles turned to Jake with a serious expression. Mr. Morrison, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Margaret looked slightly alarmed. Charles, I don't think that's necessary. It's all right, Maggie. It's time. Jake followed Charles to a corner of the range where they could speak without being overheard. Margaret remained where she was, but Jake could see tension in her posture. Mr. Morrison, Charles began, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential. Do I have your word? Of course, Jake replied, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. My real name is Charles Patterson, but during the war I was known as Colonel Patterson, military intelligence. Maggie, Margaret Williams, was one of my operatives during the Korean conflict. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Your operatives? She was part of a special unit that conducted deep reconnaissance and elimination missions behind enemy lines. What you've witnessed is the result of training that was so classified it officially never existed. Jake stared at Charles in amazement. Elimination missions? Margaret Williams was one of the finest military snipers of her generation, Charles continued. Perhaps the finest. Her confirmed kill count in Korea was significant. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Margaret Williams, the pleasant grandmother who came to his range to practice shooting, was a trained killer. A military assassin who had eliminated enemy targets with the same precision she now used to punch holes in paper targets. Why are you telling me this? Jake asked. Because Maggie is dying. The simple statement carried tremendous weight. Jake looked over at Margaret, who was cleaning her rifle with the same methodical precision she always showed. She didn't look sick. Cancer, Charles explained. She's got maybe 6 months. She doesn't know that I know, but I have contacts at the medical center where she's being treated. The doctors have told her there's nothing more they can do. Jake felt a profound sadness wash over him. In the months he had known Margaret Williams, she had become more than just a customer. She had become a friend, someone he looked forward to seeing, someone who brightened his week with her visits. What does this have to do with me? Jake asked. Maggie has spent 60 years keeping her service secret. She's never been able to talk about what she did for her country, never been able to receive recognition for her sacrifices. She's carried that burden alone for decades. Charles paused and looked directly at Jake. But I think she trusts you, and I think she deserves to have her story told, at least to someone who can appreciate what she accomplished. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this information. What exactly are you asking me to do? I want to show you something, Charles said. Something that will help you understand who Margaret Williams really is. But I need your promise that you'll handle this information responsibly. You have my word. Charles nodded toward Margaret. Maggie, could you come here for a moment? Margaret approached with obvious reluctance. Charles, what are you doing? Something I should have done years ago, Charles replied firmly. Jake, would you mind if we went to your office? I have something to show both of you. Jake led them to his small office behind the front counter. Charles reached into an inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope that looked old and worn. "These are copies," Charles explained as he opened the envelope. "The originals are still classified, but I made these before I retired." He spread several black and white photographs on Jake's desk. The images showed a young woman in military fatigues, but it took Jake a moment to recognize her as Margaret Williams. She looked to be in her early 20s, with the lean, hard look of someone who had seen combat. "This is Maggie in 1952, Charles explained. "She had just completed her training and was being deployed to Korea." Jake studied the photographs with fascination. Young Margaret looked nothing like the gentle grandmother he knew. This was clearly a professional soldier, someone trained for war. "And this," Charles continued, placing another photograph on the desk, "is her official record." Jake's eyes widened as he read the document. It listed Margaret's confirmed kills, her medals, which had never been publicly awarded, and her mission summaries. The numbers were staggering. In 18 months of deployment, Margaret Williams had eliminated over 40 enemy targets, many of them high-value officers and officials. "Good Lord," Jake whispered. Margaret was standing silently, staring at the photographs of her younger self. "Charles, you shouldn't have kept these." "Yes, I should have," Charles replied firmly. "Your service deserves to be remembered." Jake looked up from the documents to Margaret. "Mrs. Williams, this is incredible. You're a genuine war hero." "I was a soldier," Margaret said quietly. "I did what I was trained to do." "You did much more than that," Charles interjected. "Jake, the missions Maggie completed saved hundreds of American lives. Her elimination of enemy commanders disrupted major offensive operations. She was instrumental in several strategic victories that never made the history books." Jake was struggling to reconcile the woman he knew with the soldier described in these documents. "Mrs. Williams, why have you never talked about this?" "Because it was classified," Margaret replied, "and because it's not something you discuss casually. Taking a human life, even in war, even when it's justified, leaves marks that never fully heal." Charles gathered up the photographs and documents. "Jake, there's one more thing I want to show you, but we'll need to go outside." Jake was confused, but followed Charles and Margaret out of the building. Charles led them around to the side of the range building to an area Jake rarely visited. There was a small memorial garden there, dedicated to local veterans, with a brick wall displaying plaques honoring those who had served. "Jake," Charles said, "how long have you owned this range?" "About 15 years, Jake replied. "I bought it from the previous owner when he retired." "And in all that time, have you ever really looked at this memorial wall?" Jake had to admit that he hadn't paid much attention to the memorial. It had been there when he bought the property, and he had simply maintained it without studying the individual plaques. Charles led them to a section of the wall that was partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. "Look behind the wall, Jake." Jake pushed aside the vegetation and found himself looking at a section of the memorial he had never seen before. There, among plaques honoring local veterans, was a small bronze plaque that made his breath catch in his throat. The plaque read, "In memory of the unknown soldiers who served in classified operations during the Korean conflict. Their sacrifices for freedom will never be forgotten, even though their names cannot be spoken." Below the main inscription, in smaller text, was a list of dates and locations that Jake now recognized from the documents Charles had shown him. They were the dates and locations of Margaret Williams' missions. "My God," Jake whispered, "how is this possible?" Charles smiled sadly. "When this memorial was first built, I was still active in military intelligence. I made sure this plaque was included even though I couldn't explain why at the time. I always hoped that someday Maggie would see it and know that someone remembered." Margaret was staring at the plaque with tears in her eyes. For 60 years, she had believed that her service would never be acknowledged, that her sacrifices would be forgotten by history. But here, in this small memorial garden behind a shooting range in a town she had never heard of until 6 months ago, someone had created a tribute to her and the others who had served in the shadows. "Charles," Margaret said quietly, "how did you know I would end up here?" "I didn't," Charles admitted. "But I knew that eventually you'd find your way to a shooting range somewhere. You've never been able to completely leave that part of your life behind. And I hoped that when you did, maybe you'd find this and understand that your service mattered." Jake was overcome with emotion. For months, he had been wondering about Margaret Williams's background, suspecting there was more to her story than she was willing to reveal. Now he understood that he had been in the presence of a genuine American hero, someone who had sacrificed everything for her country and asked for nothing in return. "Mrs. Williams," Jake said, "I want you to know that it's been an honor having you at my range, and I want you to know that your secret is safe with me." Margaret wiped her eyes and smiled. "Thank you, Jake. You've been very kind to me." "There's one more thing," Charles said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "This is yours, Maggie. It always has been." Margaret opened the box to reveal a medal that Jake didn't recognize. It was clearly military, but unlike any decoration he had ever seen. "The Medal of Classified Service," Charles explained. "It was created specifically for people like Maggie, whose actions were too sensitive to be publicly acknowledged. Only a handful were ever awarded." Margaret held the medal with shaking hands. It was the first recognition she had ever received for her service, the first acknowledgement that what she had done mattered. "I can't accept this," she said. "Yes, you can," Charles replied firmly. "You earned it 60 years ago. I just couldn't give it to you until now." As they stood in the memorial garden, Jake realized that this moment would change everything. Margaret Williams would no longer be just a mysterious customer with exceptional shooting skills. She would be a link to a hidden part of American history, a reminder of the sacrifices made by people whose names would never appear in textbooks. "Mrs. Williams," Jake said, "would you be willing to let me add a proper plaque to this memorial? Something that honors your service specifically?" Margaret considered the request carefully. "What would it say?" "Whatever you want it to say. Or nothing at all. Just your name and years of service." Margaret looked at the memorial wall, then at Charles, then at Jake. For the first time in 60 years, she had the opportunity to step out of the shadows, to allow her service to be acknowledged, even in a small way. "Just my name," she said finally. "Margaret Williams, United States Army, 1951, 1953. That's enough." Jake nodded. "I'll take care of it." As they walked back toward the range building, Margaret seemed different somehow, lighter, as if a weight she had carried for decades had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Jake," she said, "there's something else I want you to have." She opened her rifle case and pulled out a small notebook. It was worn and weathered, filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. "This is my shooting journal from Korea," she explained. "It contains everything I learned about long-range shooting under combat conditions, techniques that were never officially documented." Jake accepted the notebook with reverence. "Mrs. Williams, I can't take this. This is history." "That's exactly why you should have it," Margaret replied. "History should be preserved, even if it can't always be publicly shared. Maybe someday, when the classifications expire, someone will be able to use this information to train the next generation of soldiers." As Margaret Williams prepared to leave Pine Valley Shooting Range for what Jake somehow knew would be the last time, she paused at the door and turned back to him. "Jake, thank you for treating an old woman with kindness and respect. You gave me the chance to remember who I used to be, and that's a gift I'll treasure for whatever time I have left." Jake watched through the window as Margaret Williams climbed into her Honda Civic and drove away. But she wasn't just Margaret Williams anymore. She was Staff Sergeant Margaret Williams, United States Army, holder of the Medal of Classified Service, veteran of operations that had helped win the Korean War. And behind the wall of Pine Valley Shooting Range, hidden among the other memorials to forgotten heroes, a new plaque would soon honor a woman whose story had finally been told, at least in part. The grandmother who could outshoot anyone had revealed her secret at last, and Jake Morrison would spend the rest of his life making sure that Margaret Williams' service would never be completely forgotten. 6 months later, when the obituary for Margaret Williams appeared in the local newspaper, it listed her as a retired librarian who was survived by distant cousins. There was no mention of her military service, no acknowledgement of her sacrifices for her country. But at Pine Valley Shooting Range, visitors could find a small bronze plaque that told a different story. And sometimes, Jake would tell those visitors about an elderly woman who once came to his range and demonstrated that heroes come in all forms, even ones wearing flower print dresses and cardigans. The notebook Margaret had given him remained in Jake's safe, waiting for the day when its secrets could be properly shared. And every year on the anniversary of the Korean War armistice, Jake would place flowers at the memorial wall, honoring a woman who had served her country with distinction and asked for nothing in return except the chance to practice her shooting at a small-town range where, for a few brief months, she had been allowed to remember who she really was.